So we will now start with the conference on the relationship between health, trade, and intellectual property that will be given by the representative of the Diplomatic Planning Secretariat of the Ministry of Foreign Relations of Brazil, Dr. Henrique Moraes. And this session will be moderated by Alejandro Gerardi of Pajo, Argentina, and I invite him to come to the front. Well, Alejandro Gerardi is an expert in public health and epidemiology. He has been working for 20 years with PAHO WHO in several destinations in the Americas. He is a professor and the director of the Department of Social Medicine of a university in Uruguay. He has been a professor for 20 years in undergraduate and graduate courses, always teaching on public health. He has worked at private and public hospitals. He is an advisor to the General Health Directorate. He has been the Assistant Director of Epidemiology and Coordinator of Health Programs at the Ministry of Health of Uruguay. Dr. Henrique Moraes, who is a diplomat, and he's working at the Diplomatic Planning Secretariat of the Ministry of Foreign Relations in Brazil between 2010 and 2012. He has been working, or he worked at the permanent delegation of Brazil in Montevideo between 2007 and 2010. He worked at the Brazilian mission in the European Union in Brussels, where he worked on the areas of intellectual property, and he also was in charge of doing a follow-up of the work of the World Customs Organizations. Before that, he worked in Brasilia in the Intellectual Property Department of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, where he did a follow-up of the discussions at the WIPO. He also was involved in the Convention of Biological Diversity at the World Trade Organization. So now I invite Mr. Henrique Moraes to take the floor and start with his lecture. Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers. It's a pleasure for me to participate in a conference like this one, which deals with an issue which is as important as this one, with very important theme, the relationship between health and intellectual property, a subject matter, a theme which has become increasingly important in the last 15 or 20 years. We have already had a chance to start discussing it. Of course, this theme, I was asked to talk about the relationship between health, innovation, and intellectual property is very wide, and I won't be able to say something which would cover the whole subject in only 1 hour. So I will summarize or limit the focus of my presentation. In order to do so, I've chosen an approach. I will talk about the relationship between the three themes, and I'm going to use a very current approach. I will try and explain how the IP regime involves, limits, and conditions the formulation or the conservation and maintenance of public health policies. This approach, which I have chosen, as a matter of fact, is also very wide. I will have to zoom in even more because I believe it won't be useful to talk about too many issues. So I have decided to analyze things from the point of view I'm more familiar with, that is the area of international negotiations. The approach I'm going to use is that of negotiation mechanisms, the state of the art, the current trends I see in negotiations in the international arena in the area of health, trade, and intellectual property. Of course, by doing so, I will use my background as a Brazilian negotiator in the area of IP, but as for 3 years I have been working in IP, I will do the analysis I will do today. When I'm able to look back at what was done, I will analyze the scenario of international politics, which may provide us with some inputs to better understand the relationship between health, trade, and IP. I am obviously talking about an analysis and an assessment, looking at it from my point of view. Not everything I'm going to say represents the opinions of any other person or organization. It's just my personal opinion. Yesterday, we began to discuss positions and what I call negotiation mechanisms were described from different points of view. I'm not going to talk about the substance of the TRIPS agreement on how it could be used. I'm not going to talk about that. I'm rather going to share with you some ideas about the political and negotiations scenario we are facing nowadays. Yesterday, the speakers talked in a comprehensive fashion about some of the challenges which are already present, which we all know about. Yesterday, the forum shifting issue was mentioned. That is when negotiations go from one forum to another one. This is something which happens continuously. We always see it. Yesterday, it was also said how the IP laws affect or influence the health area because of the trade agreements. Yesterday, somebody talked about a kind of challenge which is not very well known, but which is true, that is the export of elements through technical cooperation agreements. One of our colleagues yesterday said that it's very common for technical cooperation programs on patents, for example, to have as a goal, which is not clearly explained, but it's a goal, to export ways, methods, and guidelines for patents to different countries in Europe, US, or Asia. These are the challenges we have, and we have to face and tackle them. But today, I want to do something to go beyond that. I would like to talk about additional challenges. I'm not going to talk or describe the forum shifting, the free trade agreements, or technical cooperation issues. I'm going to talk about some other challenges which are somehow related to what we call global governance, a term which we are going to analyze in detail. These are the trends of the current political scenario, which somehow already influence the health arena internationally, or may do so. I'm talking about challenges which are additional to the ones that were mentioned yesterday, as I have already said. Again, forum shifting, free trade agreements, and exports through technical cooperation agreements. Today I'm going to talk about simultaneous challenges taking place at different levels, at a different level than the challenges we talked about yesterday. I'd like to tell you the following. What I'm going to share with you now is already happening, things that are already happening and may influence and affect, have an impact on health and other areas of global governance that may impact public health. I'm going to describe and show some trends of global governance of negotiators, which are already impacting public health. But everything which I'm going to say happens simultaneously to everything which was described yesterday. So it's a very complex scenario. We need human and financial resources to tackle all this, and it's very tough for developing countries because everything happens continuously, as we said yesterday, 24 hours a day. There are innovations continuously so as to somehow drive forward the interests of those who have more resources, neglecting the initiatives or the needs of some countries which have fewer resources. So I'm going to add additional complexity to the scenario we already know. Life is not easy. I'm not here to make things easier. I'm here to share with you some of our concerns. I think it's important to bear all this in mind because such is life. We have to face it. And we have to face all of this from the point of view of developing countries, which we are. These additional challenges, which may impact the protection or development of public health policies, as said, are challenges that were created by what we call the global governance. Global governance is a bag full of things which are not fully identified. It includes several features, several elements. It's a very wide term. What do I mean by global governance, and which elements of global governance will I take into account for my presentation? Well, I'd like to mention the following elements about global governance. First of all, informal decision-making mechanisms. We, as policymakers, have been trained and we spend our time dealing with what happens in the traditional organizations, the formal organizations, World Trade Organization, WHO, etc. These are mechanisms which somehow already have formal operating procedures. We know who does what, how the positions are coordinated. Everything has some operating principles and some bureaucracy already. What I call global governance mechanisms are those, the formal ones, but also the informal ones, these ways and procedures which we are used to dealing with. There are different scenarios which we already know about. But we are also trying to do the following, and I'm not judging this. Now there is a larger interaction between the states and the non-state stakeholders. We know what the role of donors is and which the political environment is at each organization. So we have non-state stakeholders. So we have public and non-public stakeholders, and this is the way things are. I'm not making a judgment here. The third element I'd like to stress within what I call global governance is that we are working with mechanisms that, besides the multilateral traditional mechanisms, everybody is sitting at the same table. There is a trend which has become increasingly important, and it's that decisions are increasingly more often made in unilateral fora. This is a hot topic today. So some countries make decisions which later on become multilateral rules. I'm not saying that multilateralism is something new. It has always been about somehow. What is new is the scale and the importance these unilateral mechanisms are taking up. So this is the framework on which I'm going to use for my presentation. First of all, I'd like to talk about the context where we work. We who are policymakers in different areas. Nowadays, I'm going to say something which is crystal clear, which we all know, but today saying that somebody is a policymaker in the health arena, well, it has a special value because 30 or 40 years ago, things were different. Today, those who are working in the area of health or in the area of trade or intellectual property, environment or security have to have knowledge about everything, health, environment, because all areas are interrelated. You couldn't possibly work on one area if you were not aware of all the others. It would be ineffective, not efficient. And it's an obsolete point of view to be just focusing on one area. So the concept of the approach which we should use to work with public health or health policies is a context where there is a proliferation of regimes. And again, of course, everybody knows about this. It's not enough to know about health. You must know about IP, migrations, environment, air routes, etc. Now, despite this increasing interrelationship between the different areas, somehow the legal frameworks, the disciplines are still organized in silos. We have WHO, WTO, WCO. Each of them has its own standards, regimes, and regulations, and they look at their themes and the themes of other organizations from their point of view. The rules which we are using are looked at in a monothematic fashion, that is, health or trade. WTO looks at everything from the point of view of trade. The environmental fora see everything from the environmental point of view. The WCO, which I'm going to talk about, looks at health from the point of view of customs offices. And it's an issue because there is a proliferation of regimes. Each organization looks at the world from its point of view, and there is nobody on top of everything doing a kind of arbitration. And this leads us to a cacophony. I'm not saying anything which is new. This is the way things are, and we all know this. And this bears consequences which, as I said before, well, it's impossible to work just on health. If I'm a policymaker in the health area, I must also take into account what happens in trade, environment, security, defense, etc. So this is the context in which we work, the context which is much more complex than 30, 40 years ago. So I could talk about health, give you a closed box, but today that's not the case.
So what are the additional challenges that we face, and what are the challenges that I want to show you today? I believe that the proper mission of a conference like this one is to have an overview, to give you an overview, to help you think about what's going on, or to think about what can happen, the trends, to think about them. I think it's the best way to start a day full of work like this day. So talking about additional challenges does not mean going into details. It just means showing you a snapshot, a global overview, because I know what's going on. I know what can happen in future, because in other areas of global governance, these trends are already a reality. The first challenge that I do believe we have to consider is the one relative to this movement, this motion towards the political formal forums that are shifting to technical forums. Political forums, in my opinion, are those that are made by institutions that sit at table, different representatives of all stakeholders, IP that affects health. So the forum is the table where the representative of the trade office and also the representative of other fields are there to discuss. So the situation in a certain country can be reported in full. So each country can see the issue not only from the trade perspective, but also from others' perspectives. So the country can make a better informed decision, know about the costs of the policies they are discussing. These political forums, for good or for bad, we know they are going through troubles. They are such as the WTO, the WHO, international associations in general, organizations that in recent years have been associated to lack of motion, lack of activity, stillness, political forums that are too politicized. That's why things do not move forward. I'm not going to judge these forums. I'm not going to say whether this political involvement, political participation will really give us a good or a bad overview. I think it is good, though things go and move very slowly. But there's a migration. These forums are being emptied, and this is not some genius idea. Things are moving from these forums to more technical forums. What do I mean by technical forums? Well, those where only experts sit at the table. Forums that feature by the fact that the idea only people with a certain expertise can join. For instance, being a customs officer. Unless you're a customs officer, you cannot join. Or expertise on a certain technical field. And if you don't have that expertise, you cannot be part of the forum. The problem seems to be a technicality. Just a technical issue can only be seen from the technical perspective, as if others' perspectives could not bring any good input. So those technical forums are those where issues, topics, decisions are approached only from the expertise without considering any impact on any other field. Let me give you an example. No, before I'm going to talk about this slide. Personally, I believe that we should at least discuss an issue from different perspectives, not only from the technical perspective, because it impacts other fields. It can also be seen from the political perspective. I'm not saying that if that a medical problem cannot be considered by physicians, but create forums that are made only by experts without opening the table to other inputs, I think it's artificial. This is a political decision that should be made. Create forums where decision makers are just experts or where non-experts can be included. I'm not saying that expertise is not enough. I'm just saying that other inputs from other fields, from other perspectives, always contribute to a better decision making. Interrelationships are always there. Let me give you an example of a technical forum where I was personally involved. This experience really shocked me or called my attention because it showed me a trend towards technical forums. I'm not going to go into big details, but when you make questions, I can provide more data. This is an experience in the WCO, the World Customs Organization, when I was a representative in Brussels. There was a group called SECURE. SECURE is an acronym that stands for something big. It was a very nice name with a lot of marketing impact to improve or enhance customs quality. It was an acronym that really called everybody's attention. What was SECURE? When I arrived in Brussels, my ambassador told me, Henrique, you have background in intellectual property, so you can be part of the intellectual property European agenda. But since that agenda is not moving too much, please take care of the customs issue. It's a technical issue, but you can do that. I arrived before the meeting, I received a memo, a paper. It was something new. I didn't know anything. I started reading that report. It was a report to be discussed at the meeting I was going to be part of. And this report had the format of a treaty. It was a draft article for the best customs practices. It really called my attention. I didn't read it in detail, but these best practices referred to many practices that were far beyond the TRIPS agreement. It caught my attention because before arriving in Brussels, in Brasilia, I was really following the negotiations and the discussion of the WTO, and I had never heard about anything like this. So it called my attention to have such an ambitious goal in this small forum, this clandestine forum in terms of intellectual property. I'm not saying it in a derogative way, but I thought that this was a very sensitive topic that really was not part of such a forum, shouldn't have been part of such a forum. The forum was made by government officers, customs officers, representatives from the pharmaceutical industry, and all those that hold intellectual property rights, as well as some organization as the Oecd. The first meeting I knew was going to be a hard one because discussions in the group were moving forward in a red tape fashion, but nobody was discussing the political impact of what was being discussed there. So I knew the work was going to be hard. So the example really shows that this best practices package was being discussed because the WCO was a technical forum. Customs issues were discussed there, but it actually showed to be not true. We have to pay attention to technical forums because they deal with matters that are not just technical. That is something I don't like about global governance because it impacts on intellectual property. The SECURE group worked on those best practices and nothing moved forward. Then I will explain you why. So this migration from formal forums to technical informal forums is a trend. The case of the WCO shows that this is happening because they are discussing intellectual property rights, and we don't know about that. We are not aware that these forums are discussing these type of things, and it's going on in other areas of global governance too. Another example. Another situation is when multilateral forums are not considered because minilateral forums are favored. This is not anything new. Minilateralism exists. Some countries are signatory countries, and there are minilateral forums that involve a certain number of countries. What I think is new is the scale at which and the frequency at which these forums hope their decisions be made multilateral. I have to tell you that I do not know an example about intellectual property using these mechanisms, but I do believe there may be an example. The ICH, Brazil is a member. It is a minilateral forum. Brazil is not taking part in the discussions that is involving the industry. It's a very peculiar forum. Discussions are aimed at being communicated and become standards in countries that are not involved in the decision-making process. That's a trend. In other governance, global governance areas, this is new in the money laundering and terrorism financing areas. There is a minilateral forum. Brazil and Argentina are the only South American countries that are part of it. But somehow all countries are forced to adopt the decisions made on money laundering and terrorism financing because they set mechanisms that should be enforced everywhere. I'm not saying whether Gafi is good or bad. I'm just talking about the mechanism they are using, because that mechanism shows a trend that can be copied or replied in IP rights field. We talk about Basel I, Basel II. They regulate certain aspects of banking operations, and some countries are involved in the discussions, but the decisions are made multilateral and enforced everywhere. So this is a challenge for us, for those who deal with health and intellectual property. How can we work with these complex issues, because our human resources are not so many, and we are developing countries? It's an interesting thing to understand how there are certain fad words such as global governance. This is a buzzword, this new order. These are concepts, new concepts that are so big. Global governance describes something that exists, but somehow it is new. It is trying to find a marketing buzz idea. It is not good, not bad. That's not what I'm talking about. Developed countries create these trends and disseminate the idea and tell us that this is good, this is modern. So a narrative that is very frequent tells us that global governance sets complex challenges in a complex world. The United Nations, the WTO, cannot adapt themselves to these ideas. There's a lot of literature about that. Yes, the world is complex. The WTO, the WHO, the FMI are difficult organizations that need an updating. But what are we losing when we shift from one situation to the new one, where we have informal, technical forums that are not inclusive? The two trends I showed are not inclusive. When I go from a multilateral political forum to a technical forum, I'm not including those who have no expertise. So I'm leaving out those that are considered ignorant, those that have no expertise in the matter. It's exclusion. It's also exclusion to create a club with only 6 countries that will tell us about something. So I'm not saying this is good, this is bad. I'm not telling that we have to fight this. We have just to face this new situation. We, developing countries, should be aware of the situation and face it. The easier solution, and I'm going to take something Susan said yesterday, we have to be aware. We have to be awake. New forums, new multilateral forums will come into the picture. They will tell us that the organizations are old, they need updating, and we have to be awake. We should not sleep while this happens. We should face the challenge. The key is coordination among policymakers, domestic coordination, international coordination among our countries. Let's go and talk about coordination. Domestic coordination. We can consider that forums such as the United Nations, the WTO, are caught in their own red tape, diplomatic protocols, that makes them not very flexible. It's difficult for them to adapt to new problems, to adjust to new situations. That's one narrative. That's one story that is told following a certain theoretical idea of networks of regulators. So these forums should have their place, which is not very relevant. The future is meeting regulators from different states, from private sectors, from the civil society, because they know about issues. They do not have to comply with a lot of formalities. They go straight to the point. They know each other. They socialize. So the best way to face the challenge is to give the discussion and let it in the hands of these people. We have to disaggregate the state. The foreign behavior of states within this narrative, the domestic coordination, what they do, how they are consistent, how they converge into a single idea, it's something that does not face current challenges. We have to disaggregate, and each part of the state should respond to its own field. This doesn't tell us how these agencies will talk to each other, because if they don't, the foreign policy will not be consistent. Customs can have its own foreign affairs policy, and that may affect other areas of policy, foreign policy, such as generic drugs. We have to disassemble the state, because we have to consider that state disassembling is a possibility to produce public policies that are not affected by things discussed in an expert forum. We have to understand this reality. It is a reality. I'm not saying that state disaggregation is bad. I think it's inevitable, but it's something to face. And this overlapping of regimes, the customs dealing with health issues, for instance, make us decision makers face surprising issues because generic drugs policies can be affected by a decision made by customs. Who can foresee something like that? The Global Post Union also have an IP issue. Who can think that the post office can deal with intellectual property? This shows how complex the world has become. Each one deals with things from every perspective, and our countries, developing countries, should have enhanced domestic coordination. I will take an expression: we have to re-aggregate the state. So within our own states, we have to create mechanisms to discuss, to have dialogue with those people that somehow are affected to foreign matters discussions, to international activities. This is an example I'm proud of. Brazil has got INPEs, an interministry group of intellectual properties discussions, all government stakeholders. This is also open to other stakeholders. Come together, discuss different positions. We, the Brazilians, try to behave in a coordinated way so that everyone in the government can know what's going on in the international arena. This means re-aggregating the state. This is a guideline. This is a best practice. So the text on the slide is a recommendation that somehow suggests this: states should promote mechanisms to have cross-cutting regulatory consistency and should not fall in the danger of disaggregating the state. This recommendation comes from the OECD, the Organization for Economic Commerce Development, which was made by the rich countries. Its members are aware of this aggregation, but they do not fall for it. They know they need to re-aggregate the states and mitigate the effects of disaggregation.
There is a recent resolution by the Council of the OECD, and it's part of its agenda on international regulatory cooperation. I'm not trying to tell you that it's only us, the developing countries, who have to do this. No, everybody should do this. All the countries that are involved in this scenario, which is so fragmented and complex and which has multiple layers. Now, leaving the domestic arena, and now I'm talking about the coordination of developing countries. I'm going to talk about this, which is important. In 2009, the United Nations prepared a document that tackled the issue of global health from the point of view of the international vision, because the healthcare regime was being fragmented as it was tackled by several regimes which were encroaching the peace, is the point. So We need a consistent action in health so that the healthcare regime does so as to prevent this regime from losing its importance. Some recommendations of this document go along these lines. It's necessary to improve the coordination among the fora that deal with health issues. In the case of the World Customs Organizations where I worked, it was key to create a coalition of developing countries. And thanks to such a coalition, in which Brazil received the assistance of Centro-Sur, of South Center in Geneva, well, we were able to prevent this secure agenda from being moved forward. But the challenge is actually to take these technical issues and explaining them in a language that could be understood. What is at stake here, and what was at stake in that case was the trade of generics with recommendations like this one, because it could suffer a negative impact. And many things happened in Europe. Europe became aware of the possible issues, and actually Secure was not moved forward. As a Brazilian diplomat in Brussels, I would mention this example of Secure very often because many of the customs rules and regulations were in the agreement, and this created, when I said this, I was trying to create awareness among the members of the European Parliament, because it was clearly showing that something which was dealt with in the WCO and the European legislation has really important consequences. And in closing, well, what is Isags as a forum that gathers people who work in policy making, in health care? What is it that you should do? Well, I believe that Isags is filling in a gap because it creates a forum, a space for policymakers in the health area can know what is happening all over the world. It sort of multiplies the antennas, because it's not only Brazil, Argentina, Suriname, or Guyana. It's all of us together who talk to one another and say, well, this is happening and this is important. So we multiply our antennas, so to say. I believe that we are able to keep on the alert. We don't fall asleep, because there are 12 countries which take turns to sleep, and this is key. Another important element, and this is again my personal opinion, is that our countries have different areas of expertise, and if we all sit together at the same table, we share our expertise. If for one country something, or somebody may say this is technical, somebody else may tell him, no, this is not a technical issue. This has consequences such as A, B, C, or D. So we need to create awareness among all the countries in the region at Isags. So I think this could be a possible agenda. I know it's quite ambitious. It's not easy, but I think that Isags, unlike any other organization, is at a privileged position to work in this way. So cooperation among developing countries is key. Listening to other people's point of view. I'm not a policymaker, but I work in areas which may impact health in this case. So I think it's very important to work with our colleagues to be able to navigate in this complex world today. We need a global vision, because the challenges come from the most unexpected places. Thank you very much.